I was standing in my tiny kitchen making dinner on a normal Wednesday night, in addition to the subtle smell of old wood from the flat I had just moved into. The air was filled with the aroma of herbs and garlic. I had it, even though it wasn't much, it seemed like a safe environment for the first time in years. This isn't where I should be. I wasn't meant to be alone myself, cut off from my entire world. I should have returned to the life I'd created and given up everything for. But here I was, somehow. In a small apartment far from the family I believed I would always defend, in a city I hardly recognized. There was silence in the apartment, no kids fighting, no footsteps reverberating along the corridors, no background music. Me and my ideas alone. I had been a giver for most of my life. I gave all I had, love, time, money, and everything else to create a family that would support me. But it didn't matter somehow, not when those uninterested eyes were fixed on me, as though I were merely a servant, a shadow in my own house. After my ex-husband left, I was left to raise my son by myself. To put food on the table, I had done many jobs, cleaning motel rooms at night and shopping groceries during the day. I put all of my energy into creating a life for him. I utilized the tiny inheritance my parents gave me when they died away to purchase a house, believing it would be a home for my family. But in Olivia's opinion, I had somehow turned into the assistance. I ought to have known. I should have anticipated it, but I failed to do so. I had spent so much time acting as though nothing was wrong, convincing myself that the sacrifices would be worthwhile and that they would realize how much I had helped them. However, something inside of me exploded the instant Olivia gave me that look and referred to me as the unofficial maid at that meal. I was no longer merely invisible. I had no value. At the time, I remained silent. I made no attempt to defend myself. I simply excused myself, placed the bottle of wine on the counter, and left. I refrained from screaming. I didn't plead. I simply strolled. When my kid Ethan called my name, I didn't turn around. He rushed barefoot after me in the driveway, but I didn't even stop. I was aware of my obligations. I had to go. I didn't get any sleep that night. In my new apartment, I sat on the edge of the bed and gazed at the door that I had painted myself in my previous residence. I reflected about the years I had invested in that place and the day I had signed the mortgage documents, the recollections of rearing Ethan there, preparing meals, and acting as though I belonged to something that no longer felt like myself. I didn't bother unpacking the following morning. I fed the cat, made coffee as usual, and waited. Olivia, dressed for yoga, came downstairs too preoccupied with her phone to even look at me. I waited for her to say something, anything at all. However, she didn't. I gave her the keys to everything, the keys to the house. "What is this?" She frowned as she asked. I said, "Good luck with the mortgage payment now." And through the house that no longer felt like mine, I passed her. Nothing was taken with me. Not even the clothing hanging in the closet. Not the furniture, nor the photographs on the wall. Only the coat I wore the day I brought Ethan home from the hospital and my handbag. I didn't bid them farewell. I didn't have to. They had abandoned me after I had sacrificed all for this family. However, I had had enough of being invisible. The maid wasn't me. I wasn't the assistance. Furthermore, I was not going to plead for a place in their lives any longer. I left without turning around. I knew exactly where I wasn't staying, but I had no idea where I was heading. I felt as though I was floating in someone else's life on my first night in the apartment. It wasn't the noise, the constant give and take, or the disarray of my previous life. No, this was not like the others. There was quiet. Everything was enveloped in a heavy, oppressive silence that was like an old blanket. The only sound in the room was the quiet buzz of the refrigerator as I sat on the couch and stared at the broken plaster on the ceiling. The air was stuffy and dry when the heater clicked on. Nothing in the small flat seemed familiar, but it was mine. Now I was alone and had nothing. And for the first time in a long time, I had a glimmer of freedom that I hadn't experienced in years. However, it wasn't the freedom I had anticipated. There wasn't a broad, overpowering feeling of relief. No, it wasn't that loud. More disturbing. I had no idea how to fill the void. The silence and the amount of space left me unsure of what to do. I made no phone calls. I didn't make contact with anyone. It was because no one had contacted me, not because I had no one to call. Nobody had arrived, not even Ethan. Perhaps he was simply too busy, or perhaps Olivia had instructed him not to get in touch with me. but I knew the truth in my heart. He was too indifferent to make contact. Never has he been so concerned. Not at all. I sat there looking out the window at the rain outside while holding the broken mug in my hands. The streets were cold and far away, and the city was strange. I had put a lot of effort into creating a life for Ethan that I believed was worthwhile, yet here I was, by myself. The days that followed were a blur of routine. I went to the grocery shop a couple of times, but nothing seemed genuine. Being in my own skin made me feel alienated. I consumed microwaved soup and peanut butter sandwiches. I made no phone calls. I had no desire to. Then something changed one afternoon. Before leaving the house, I packed some old boxes, but I hadn't been able to part with them, so I was rummaging through them, old letters, scrapbooks, and pictures. Everything seemed to be someone else's life. I discovered the letter at that point. I didn't know who sent it. It came from my great Aunt Ruth. She had left me something, but she had died years ago. Something that would completely alter the situation. With the paper crackling in my palms, I unfurled the letter. The letter was dated nearly 30 years ago, and Ruth had been a nurse. "You have returned, if you are reading this. I'm sorry you were forced to." A beat skipped in my chest. It had been years since I last saw Ruth. She was one of the few persons who had always encouraged me and believed in me. I read on. Ruth had been employed at the medical facility where Ethan was born. The night I gave birth, she had noticed something odd, a mishap involving the infants. However, she had been too scared to speak. It was already too late when she attempted to bring up the matter. The infants were already at home. Ruth, however, had not stopped digging. Years later, she discovered a settlement from the hospital hidden deep in her papers. That's when she realized, my son wasn't Ethan. I held the letter with trembling hands. I was having trouble breathing. This was not feasible. However, it was. Ruth had always been suspicious about that night, the room transfer, and the tag misunderstanding. However, I never considered questioning it. I simply took what I was told. Everything was different today. It was more than just a letter. It was evidence that all of my beliefs and life experiences were false. Ruth had included a little image of a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket, and I just stared at it. Michael Jameson was the name written on the back of the picture. My son wasn't this. I didn't own Ethan. I wasn't as angry as I had anticipated. The grief didn't affect me. I experienced a peculiar sense of relaxation. This was the first time in my life that everything made sense. Not because I didn't love Ethan. It wasn't me. Despite all the years of uncertainty and the separation I had felt from him, I wasn't at fault. And for the first time, I understood that I had been living in delusion for so long that I had never given myself a chance to consider my role in this narrative. I set the letter down and got to my feet. Although I was unsure of my destination, I was certain that I needed to locate Michael, the actual Michael. The goal was not to win him back. Reclaiming him as my son wasn't the goal. The goal was to discover the truth, and perhaps just possibly discovering who I am in the process. I sat with the letter for days. When the city outside was quiet at night, I would take it out once again and read it. Attempting to figure out what it was about, it didn't seem genuine. How was that possible? Ethan had been raised by me. I had held him when he wept, felt his joy reverberate throughout the home, and seen him grow. I thought I knew him all those years. However, everything I believed to be true was incorrect. The sensation that the universe I had created had suddenly collapsed beneath me was still with me. I had loved him all my life. I had loved him with all my heart, no matter what. Was I now expected to believe that it was all a lie? However, it wasn't Ethan's passing that kept me awake at night. Michael Jameson was the name. Who was he? Where had he gone? Had he lived his life similar to mine? Wondering who ought to have brought him up. Was he aware of the reality? Was there someone out there who might have been me? I had no idea how to respond to those inquiries. However, I knew I needed to locate him. I tried to piece together what little knowledge I had online for hours. Only brief information on the Jameson family, a affluent, well-educated couple who lived a few miles away, was provided. There were no simple answers. Michael was 29 years old. His parents were still living. No other offspring had ever been born to them. I was both so close and yet far away. My inquiries kept growing as I gained more knowledge. He was out there, though. And that much was certain. I didn't get in touch right away. I wasn't prepared. I had to get ready for what I was going to do. I couldn't just walk up to someone and tell them the truth. I began returning to the bookshop. It has nothing to do with Michael. Not quite yet. However, I always felt something stirring within of me when I entered that bookstore. It was something I hadn't experienced in years. Although he wasn't the main cause of my return, Michael had a role. He contributed to the force that was drawing me in the direction of something different and novel. The bookshop felt secure. I didn't have to pretend that everything was fine or hide from the truth. It felt like a place where I could breathe. I pretended to be a frequent customer and browsed for hours. And Michael, he saw each and every time he began to inquire about books concerning my life. I ducked the question at first. I wasn't prepared to reveal my identity to him. However, he once asked me a question about myself that caused me to pause. He piled books on the counter and remarked, I've seen you in here a lot. You enjoy these older books a lot. Tell us about yourself. After staring at him for a while, I gave him a gentle grin. I remarked, I'm just someone who's figuring things out. For a brief time, I believed he understood something without my having to express it. As his eyes softened, I understand that. He responded quietly, I'm still working things out as well. I desired to inform him. I wanted to express everything. However, I was unable to. Not quite yet. Not until I had my own understanding. I realized something had changed as I made my way home that night. Despite his ignorance, Michael was gradually fitting into the puzzle. Unknowingly, he was completing the gaps in my life that had long been absent. However, the nagging feeling in the back of my mind persisted. The reality. The real story of Ethan. The real Michael. However, that didn't deter me from continuing. It actually made me push harder. I began to investigate further. I looked into all I could uncover on the Jameson family, including their public records and history, and my stomach turned over what I discovered. The Jamesons had more than simply money. They were strong, they were influential and had connections. If necessary, they were the type of family that could hide things. It dawned on me then that I couldn't just locate Michael. I needed to exercise caution. Too many things were on the line. I couldn't just enter his life and start a fight. I have to be strategic. I began writing in a second journal. This.time. I'm more interested in facts than feelings. Names.dates.puck records. And company filings. I was no longer only in mourning. I had a plan. Even Ethan had no idea what I was doing. He was unaware of what I had discovered. Furthermore, I wasn't sure if I was prepared to tell him. However, I was drawing nearer. I was searching for more than just Michael. I was trying to find answers. And everything was about to change because of those replies. The new apartment was no longer the only thing. I had been so used to the silence, but it wasn't just that. Something larger than I could ignore was changing inside of me. I was waking up instead of merely going through the motions. A part of me was beginning to feel alive again. As much as I hated to acknowledge it, I still hadn't found the answer to Michael, but I wasn't prepared to confront him head on. Not quite yet. I had devoted countless years to attempting to be someone else's solution or response. Without all the labels, without being Olivia's boss, without being Ethan's mother, without being everything to everyone else. I wasn't sure who I was. I so kept my distance and observed Michael from a distance. My haven was the bookshop. Every time I entered, I had the impression that I was gradually reviving and beginning to exist for myself. Naturally, he noticed. Michael was constantly aware, he would say, "You're back." Grinning kindly as ever, an additional book to read, perhaps, I would say. Or perhaps just some quiet time for a short while. He would smile and engage in conversation. It no longer felt like nothing to engage in small talk. There was a sensation. I became aware that I was beginning to desire more than mere conversation. I was beginning to crave attention, and it was because I wanted to stop hiding from myself for the first time in years, not because I needed someone else to approve of me. However, there were still unresolved issues about Ethan and Michael. I was no longer able to ignore them. I kept thinking about the truth. Ruth's letter, the DNA test, and the hospital records were among the documents I went over again every night. Every time I discovered anything new, the pieces of the puzzle fit together, but the final image seemed even more unattainable. Then, one day, something unexpected occurred. I got another SMS from Ethan. The message was so brief that it hardly seemed to be from him. "How are you?" Mom. I allowed the message to remain on my screen for a while, staring at it. Weeks had passed, silence for weeks, nothing for weeks, and this now, I didn't respond. I was unable to. Not quite yet. However, it was sufficient to arouse my curiosity. He still had me in his life. I still had some control over it too. At that point, I understood that my absence and silence weren't the end. It was only the start. I had to do something. Not yet, though. I wasn't prepared to take action on anything. Not quite yet. I had a different reason for walking into town the following morning. I was no longer pacing aimlessly. I was trying to find answers. I also knew just where to begin. As usual, the bookstore was silent, but as soon as I entered, I noticed Michael standing by the window, gazing out at the street. When he noticed me, he turned and said, "Back again," in a warm, smiling voice, but I could hear something in it now that wasn't there before. Curiosity, perhaps. It might have been hope. Perhaps it was both. With a firm voice, I said, "I need to talk to you, not in this place, not right now." But shortly, slowly, he nodded, "Yes, whatever you require." With my heart hammering in my chest, I turned to go. The reality was very near. I sensed it. However, I was not yet prepared. A part of me needed to take my time doing this. I wasn't going to enter his life and tell him everything at once. First, I needed to make sure I understood it. A few days later, I discovered something, a minor, unimportant detail that anyone else might have missed. However, I saw it, a report on credit. The financial situation of the Jamesons. It was there, concealed under several layers of documents. The wealthy, well-connected family with the ideal existence was on the verge of financial ruin. Although Michael was unaware of it at the time, his family's existence was precariously based. I discovered more the more I dug. Olivia was drowning in debt from all of her business deals and lifestyle coaching. Months after quitting his work, Ethan was barely making ends meet. They were acting as though they were someone they weren't. And the house's deed was in my possession. It was the person who had always cleaned up after them. I went back to writing, not for me or for therapy, but for a greater purpose. My name was still attached to the house, my house. Olivia was unable to refinance. Ethan was unemployed. Everything was falling apart. However, they were still unaware of it. I refused to let it go easily. I had no intention of punishing them. All I wanted was for them to experience what it was like to have their world upended, to witness the collapse of everything they believed they had constructed and everything they took for granted. They believed they could discard me. However, they were mistaken. I wasn't finished. I also had no intention of begging to sit at their table this time. I was going to reclaim what was rightfully mine. All of the things I had learned about Michael and my own life were starting to weigh too much for me to handle. However, I knew I couldn't go back at this point. I had to stop acting like everything was all right and living my life as though it wasn't. I was no longer only fleeing. I wasn't only getting by. I was retaliating silently, methodically. However, I was engaged in combat. Ethan was no longer the focus. Olivia wasn't even at issue. It has to do with me about taking back the things that were properly mine. I was aware that I would not be able to regain everything, not in the manner I had envisioned. However, the family I had created on my own, the house, and the things I had worked for would all recognize the negative effects of taking me for granted. Already, the first domino had fallen. Olivia and Ethan were unaware that their life was going to fall apart, and the house had gone up for sale. I didn't feel happy, angry, or content. I simply sensed serene, as if something more powerful had finally taken the place of the stillness that had been pursuing me for so long. I kept thinking about Michael. I became increasingly aware that this was more than just the house as I gave him more thought. The truth wasn't the only thing at stake. It was about figuring out how to live in a different way, a different myself that wasn't preoccupied with taking care of or serving others. One day, though, I was unable to ignore it any longer, like I normally did. I entered the bookstore. Michael was looking through a pile of books while he stood behind the counter. His eyes were gentle and familiar as he glanced up at me. "You're back," he remarked with a smile. However, it was more than simply small conversation this time. I could feel the weight in his voice this time. Even though he wasn't sure what it was, he felt something had changed. I said, "I need to talk to you." Although I spoke steadily, there was a trembling in my voice. I was unable to resist. "I have to tell you something. Something you won't expect." For a brief moment, his smile wavered, and he nodded. All right, let's have a conversation. It felt different this time as we sat down in the tiny back room where we had previously spoken. Something neither of us had spoken aloud had made the air feel heavier. I was unsure about where to start. It was difficult to know how to uncover the truth without hurting him because it had been hidden for so long. He was entitled to know, though. The truth is, "You're not my son," I answered, my voice trembling a little, like stones. The words tumbled out of my mouth. Heavy, hard. However, they were accurate. Confusion sank into his face as he blinked. "What are you saying?" I inhaled deeply. "Your mother is not me. I loved you and raised you, but you weren't born to me. Michael, you were exchanged at birth. It's the wrong family that raised you. You should have been born to your biological parents, the Jamesons." It was deafeningly quiet between us. His mind was attempting to piece it together, and I could see it. I didn't anticipate that he would grasp everything immediately. Hell, I didn't understand it. I took out the envelope that included the DNA results, the hospital records, and Ruth's letter, which I had kept with me. Between us, I placed it on the table. His gaze swept over the documents as he tried to make sense of everything. "This isn't possible," he said. You raised me. All these years, I thought I was your son," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You are. However, the reality is that you were assigned to the incorrect family. And I've kept that secret for a very long time. You weren't at fault, and it wasn't mine. However, that is the reality. You also deserve to be aware of it." He sat back, his hands shaking as he grasped the papers, his face white. "So, who am I?" His voice was no more than a whisper when he inquired. "For me." What does this mean? For us. I had no idea how to respond to that. How was I able to? "It implies that you are who you choose to be," I muttered, "not who you were told to be by others. Michael Jameson is who you are, and you have a say in what happens next." He seemed to grasp everything, though I wasn't positive. I had felt the weight of it for all those years, and he seemed to feel it in his own way. After a little period of stillness, Michael glanced up at me and stated, in a raw voice, "I don't know what to do with all this." "I have no idea what it all means," I said. "You don't have to know just yet. There's a lot to process. However, you don't have to face it alone. No more." I experienced a sense of hope for the first time in a long time. Not because I had rediscovered my son, not because I knew exactly where I was going. However, because I had been honest, and sometimes all you need to start over is to tell the truth. I didn't feel like the lady I used to be when I left the bookstore. I didn't feel lost. I didn't experience invisibility. I sensed complete. I had given up on fixing anything. I had no intention of seeking atonement. I was merely surviving. And I was living for myself for the first time in my life. Sadly, I was not present when the house sold. However, I didn't have to be. I was already over it. I had closed that chapter, and the house was only a memory. There was space for something fresh now. I had sacrificed everything for a life that had collapsed. However, I was constructing something better in its stead. At last, something I could claim as my own. I didn't require the approval of others. Not anyone's, not Olivia's, and not Ethan's. I was unique, and it was sufficient. Sometimes you have to lose everything in order to discover who you are. We devote a significant portion of our lives to giving people our time, effort, and love in the hopes that others would notice and value us. However, the reality is that nobody else will value us unless we do. This tale serves as a reminder that we don't need approval from others. We don't have to assume the roles of caregiver, provider, or ones who give their all without expecting anything in return. The roles we perform for other people do not define who we are. It's characterized by how we defend ourselves and the bravery we muster to leave when we're not being accepted for who we really are. It's never too late to make a fresh start, find your voice again, and create a life that is wholly your own. Don't wait for anyone's approval. Your true journey starts when you make the decision that you deserve better.